Hello, this is Argent. Now, to even attempt to cover this in just one video, one reactionary review is probably foolish. The Souls lore is probably the deepest lore of any video game series, and it's the fact that there's entire YouTube channels like Viti or Epic Name Bro or some other people who are just dedicated to the lore of the series is an indication. I'm just going to try and give you a bit of a taste. Of some of the kind of the main themes, but more kind of focusing on the structure of it, because a lot of people are very confused by it, understandably so, and I was really confused by it until a little while ago. I recently read a book about classical myth. I'll post a link to it if I can remember. Not exactly a book, but there's a company called The Teaching Company, and they produce lectures. So it's like a complete course of lectures. So it's like 12 hours long. I just call it a book because it's available on Audible, and it's about as long as a book to listen to. So I did one on classical Greek myths. And when I was listening to it, it suddenly made Dark Souls make sense. Because there's a lot of issues with Dark Souls if you try to take the timeline and kind of impose a normal, I guess, sense of logic to it. You notice some things are inconsistent. A lot of things just don't really make sense. It's really hard to determine when things happen. It's hard to determine who people are. There's always these like vague allusions. There's a lot of things that might contradict each other. Just a lot of things aren't answered. And before I thought that was maybe just kind of bad writing, but upon kind of reading this book about myth, it suddenly really made sense to me, and I was suddenly kind of struck just by how brilliant it was. So we can't view Dark Souls the way you view most video games. It's not a narrative, really. It's myth. It's myth and legend, which is something a bit different. Now, how does myth differentiate between other types of stories? Well, myth normally, the goal of myth is not to tell a coherent story. It doesn't have to be internally consistent. It doesn't even have to be logical. Myth serves a lot of purposes. At kind of a very basic level, it can serve to be an explanation of how things came about. It can also contain aspects of real history. Just because something's a myth doesn't mean it's not based on something or isn't largely true. Like for instance, with the Minotaur of Crete, you'll say, well, that's completely crazy. But when they excavated Crete, they found there was a palace that resembled the labyrinth that you could very easily get lost in. You can even get lost in the ruins. They discovered pictures of a bunch of young Greeks, something involving a bull. There's pictures of the Minotaur everywhere. So there was some kind of very dangerous festival that involved young Greeks from the mainland who would come to Crete, and there would be kind of a labyrinth, and there'd be bulls and stuff. So obviously there wasn't a real Minotaur, but the story actually has a fair bit of basis in reality. So we have that. Then a lot of myth is kind of ideological in nature. It's kind of how a society represents itself. It's how a society kind of justifies its moral values and its worldview. So myth kind of serves all of these different purposes. I think you have to keep in mind, myth doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean it's not like someone sat there and it's like, oh, let's come up with a fairy story. It's a mix of a lot of different things. Just because something's not completely historical doesn't mean it's true. It can contain certain unchanging aspects of wisdom or unchanging universal truths about the way the world is. I think to a certain extent, and I haven't read him that much, but that's kind of like the point of figures like Evola, that within all these, like, kind of, you look at different gods, you look at different mythologies, and you kind of find these common underlying themes, and regardless of whether or not they actually existed, it indicates specific things about how humans view themselves. So, I think when you're looking at Dark Souls and you're playing the games, if you're trying to find an absolute timeline, you're not going to be able to. I mean, definitely things happen before other things, but there's not going to be explanations for everything. There's going to be contradictions. There's going to be things that don't really make a lot of sense. And what you kind of have to do is just turn off kind of your modern scientific Western kind of brain and just not look too deep into some things. Because a lot of myths will be contradictory. I think going back, if I can remember, with regards to the Minotaur, a woman named Medea helped Theseus escape the island. And in some versions of the story, she's a goddess who helped him escape the island, and she used a spell to make him forget about her and sail away without her. And in others, Theseus is just a dick who sails away and leaves her behind. And both are told and both are considered true. So you'll have a lot of stuff like that. The problem with Dark Souls is not really the first or third game. It's the second game is just so disconnected from the first and third game that it really just stretches kind of myth to a breaking point. But we're just going to go and we're going to look at the opening, and I'm going to kind of dissect it a bit. I'm not going to honor every specific myth, but I'm just going to kind of give you a taste of what I'm talking about. So we're just going to watch the opening. I'm sorry, audio balancing is very hard using Bandicam. I'll just pause it whenever I'm talking.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog.
Okay, so this is this is in the beginning. Now, in general, non-Christian, non-monotheistic mythologies tend to view the world as being eternal. In Christian, Zoroastrian, or Jewish, Islamic, that kind of thing, the world is not eternal. The world didn't exist, and then God created it. In other mythologies, the world is held to either be eternal or cyclical. And generally speaking, the oldest back we can go is to some sort of time when there was mist, there was water, there was snow. There was something just kind of indistinct. In the Rig Veda, I think it says, like, what was there in the beginning? There was a great seed, and then there was water, infinitely deep. So in, like, the Hindu conception, it was just an infinite ocean with nothing in it. In the Greek conception, there's a bunch of different versions of it. Some believe it's chaos, and chaos can be nothing. Or it can be kind of just unformed substance, like substance that was yet to come into being, potential. But there was some kind of mist-filled world, and the actual origins of creation aren't particularly well established, nor is that really important.
A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons.
Once again, this is pretty common for there to be some sort of beings who existed prior to man. Be they frost giants, be they the dark elves, be they, I forget what it is in Greek mythology, like cyclopses and monsters. In Hinduism, I think you have demons and a bunch of different stuff. It's not uncommon for it to be this race that existed in this kind of gray time.
But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold. Life and death. And of course, light and dark.
Okay, so once again, this is a very common theme. Very often in the early kind of mythology, and I'm including Christianity in that. Once again, I'm not saying that this didn't happen. I'm not saying it's not true. But if you look at something like Genesis, it is to a certain extent a mythic thing. That means it's not supposed to be literal. It's written in a mythic style, so it's parts of it are historical, parts of it are representative, parts of it are kind of trying to convey something to an uneducated population. That doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean someone sat there and was like, let's create this lie to trick people, which is kind of what some atheists say. But yeah, so in the beginning, kind of in Christianity of the Garden of Eden, it is kind of a gray existence. It's happy, but there's no death, there's no disparity, there's nothing. It's just this kind of somewhat pleasant experience, but man can't grow and change. Man can't reach his full potential. We have this in a lot of different things. In Greek mythology, we have man as this kind of being this pathetic creature until Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to man. And the fire is, like, people say, well, how does fire do all that stuff? That's not really the point. The fire is also symbolic of wisdom. Fire is growth. Fire is change. But as kind of a punishment for that, Zeus gives woman to man. That's when Pandora is. Somehow men had reproduced, and somehow men had been much better prior to Pandora. When Pandora came to man, they were kind of bound to her, and it was viewed as a curse. Men also grew old and died. Life and death kind of don't exist in kind of the prior state, in kind of the earliest form. Everything's just kind of gray and eternal. But you get light and dark, you get fire and ice, and from that you get kind of modern humans who tend to be born of fire, although ironically enough, in Dark Souls, humans are born from dark, not fire, which is kind of interesting. But you have this conflict that comes into the world that's kind of both good and bad. It doesn't have the blandness of the gray, because there's still evil, there's still cruelty, there's still pain, but there's also all kind of the good things that come with it.
Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame.
Now this is another kind of common thing we see in a lot of mythologies. Where the gods come from is not always particularly well understood. Actually, where humans come from is not always very well understood. I think in Greek, they just kind of show up. In a lot of them, they just kind of show up. Even in Christianity, God creates Adam and Eve, and then we have Cain and Abel, but there's obviously other humans around, because Cain, like, leads with his tribe. So, and that issue isn't really dealt with, nor does it seem to be particularly important, and we see that in a lot of different mythologies. Why are there so many humans? Or they might deal with making a couple humans, but there's clearly other humans around. The gods themselves, there's not always a specific origin story. They're just kind of there. Obviously, the gods in Greek mythology do have an origin story, but even then, it's like, where did the first gods come from? They just kind of came from chaos, and they were just kind of there. Gaia was just kind of there. Rhea was just kind of there, etc. And they found the swords of lords within the frame. So there's often this kind of concept of, there's kind of this primordial, unformed world, and the first gods kind of divided up between them. I mean, in terms of Greek mythology, Zeus takes the sky and earth. Hades takes the underworld, and Poseidon takes the ocean, and so we kind of have this this division of the world and the division of kind of creation.
Nito, the first of the dead.
Now, I think it's interesting to just keep in mind, death is not the opposite of light in Dark Souls. Death is the opposite of life. Gwyn really, as we'll see, has no real problem with Nito. Nito's opponent is the Witch of Islith, who is life. Now, we don't know if Nito is the first to die or the first of the dead. I think it's interesting. My interpretation tends to be that he's the first thing, because before then the world was eternal and unchanging, and when they found flame, they brought both death and life into the world, and he was the first thing to die, and that kind of combined with his shard of the first flame. So what the Lord Souls are is they're kind of portions of the first flame. My understanding is that the world kind of becomes the way it is because the first flame, which kind of sustained all of creation, has been broken up into different pieces. And kind of the goal of the first Dark Souls game is to regather all of the different parts of the souls. because you have to defeat Gwyn and regain the kind of shards of the light fragment that he gave out. You have to defeat the Witch of Islith and kill Nito and regain the Lord Soul of Death. And you yourself, from killing so many people and reabsorbing fragments of the Dark Soul, are the bearer of the Lord Soul of the Dark. So by defeating all the lords, putting their souls into the Lord Soul, Lord Vessel, and then sacrificing yourself, you basically are healing the world by returning everything to kind of its primal state. So the first flame can be rekindled and can regenerate the world.
The Witch of Islith and her daughters of chaos.
See, we really don't know who these people are. Are they humans? Are they mortals? Because humans come about later, as we'll see. It's interesting because if you look at Anor Londo in the game, which is the place where the gods dwell, it's really cool because there's two staircases. There's like a small set of stairs, and then there's huge stairs, and the huge stairs are for gods. In Dark Souls, divine beings are just big, are just tall. Guinevere is massive. She's also busty, which leads to a lot of people remarking when they see her. Actually, let me find a picture of Guinevere. Which leads a lot of people to saying they kind of just want to crawl in there and fall asleep. But anyways, Guinevere is huge. She is a giant being. She is, oh, sorry, I thought that was a picture. Very professional. Yeah, so there, like, she's all the gods are huge. So the question is, were they like that before, or is it just a sign of their power? This concept throughout mythology of this race of kind of giant semi-divine beings. In Christianity, they're referenced in Genesis as the offspring of gods and humans. In other religions, you also have similar concepts.
Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his faithful knights.
Once again, we kind of have this interesting thing where gods represent something. And they're kind of this ambiguous middle ground between the personification of a natural force and a being who just happens to draw their power from a specific force. Like, Gwyn is the god of the sun. People worship the sun and they equate it with Gwyn, but he's also a man. At the end of Dark Souls 1, you fight Gwyn and you kill him, but the sun doesn't disappear. So is Gwyn the sun? Is the physical body of Gwyn an incarnation of the sun? It's very kind of confusing and vague, and it's hard to determine. Is Nito death? Is he kind of a personification of death? Is he death itself? It's very kind of confusing because all the demons and all of the kind of life is implied to come from the Witch of Islith. But when you kill her and you take her Lord Soul, life doesn't stop existing. So we have this kind of interesting, vague
furtive pygmy,
stuff.
so easily forgotten.
So the furtive pygmy takes the Dark Soul, although it's not very well explained here. But the furtive pygmy is the first human.
With the strength of lords, they challenge the dragons. Gwyn's...
Now, I find this interesting. This is obviously a reference to Zeus, but also to other kind of warrior king gods. Indra is also a warrior king god, and he is also the god of lightning. Lightning is often kind of seen for... so is Thor. It's very common to see these... the kind of the king god to be associated with lightning, at least in kind of Indo-European mythology. It's kind of a sign of rulership. And much like Zeus uses his lightning bolts against the Titans, Gwen uses them against the dragons.
Witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease. And Seath, the Scaleless, betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more.
Now, I'm sure there are concepts of the traitor. I'm just not really sure of them off the top of my head, but I'm sure you could kind of find something related to Seath.
Thus began the Age of Fire.
And this is kind of another common theme where immediately following the kind of the creation, the end of the Age of Grey, you have a Golden Age. In Greek, it's literally called the Golden Age, which is the period where the Titans ruled the Earth. And then they were overthrown. Then they were overthrown, and then they were overthrown until eventually we got the modern gods. So we kind of have this Golden Age. This is also in Zoroastrianism. This is also in Hinduism. And I think this is also in different forms of Buddhism. I'm not really sure. It's a very common concept in Indo-European religions that you have kind of an age. It's sometimes 4 ages, it's sometimes more, it's sometimes fewer. But you kind of have ages. And in like the first ages, magic is very powerful. Magic is very prevalent. The gods walk among us. And over time, this starts to fade. And reality becomes more and more fallen. And it also sees kind of a rise of humans, and humans begin to become strong enough to challenge the gods. Now, it depends on the various one. How it works in Greek mythology actually is, in some versions, you have a decline of ages, then you have the Age of Heroes, the Homeric Age, where you have like Hercules, you have the Trojan War, you have Theseus, you have Perseus, you have all these heroes, and they briefly regenerate it, and they briefly kind of set things right. At the same time, though, their time of heroism is signifying humanity almost being able to challenge the gods for mastery of creation. And generally speaking, after this period, you have a complete loss of interaction with the gods and the rest of the world. So I think that's pretty interesting. You also have that in Christianity, where the gifts start to fade by the end of Acts, and miracles and revelations come to an end by the end of the 1st century. And with basically Revelation, miracles and the book of Revelation, miracles etc. become less involved in life. So the rise of humans comes with the decline of gods. So you'll have this Golden Age.
But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers, and man sees not light.
So this is kind of the, in mythology, this is often kind of the dark period that comes before the Age of Heroes and then leads to modern man. So that's kind of, you have this big decline. In Hinduism, this is when we have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and just kind of those things, where we have this age of just complete negative karma, disorder, dharma has basically vanished. And we have gods and heroes who set about making the world right. However, it's generally acknowledged at the end of it that it's only a forestalling measure, and it's only buying humanity a bit of time before the end. And I think that's a pretty kind of accurate way to kind of portray it and to look at it. So in this game, we have the undead curse, which comes about, which prevents humans from dying and has drained most of the power from the gods, to the point where at the time of Dark Souls, most of the gods have actually fled the destruction of the world and gone across the sea and gone to other places. But yeah, so we have, so Dark Souls is kind of supposed to be the Age of Heroes. The gods have lost a lot of their power, and we have powerful humans and powerful demigods who are trying to rebuild the world. And kind of at the end of Dark Souls, if you, I think, which is the canon ending to me at least, you link the flame, you kindle another Age of Fire for a couple centuries before the decline will start yet again. If you take the other option, you basically kill the gods and you end their reign once and for all, and you create a you create a world that's just for humans, the Age of Darkness, which is not what it sounds like, because this is mythology. This is not kind of modern Christian thought, because the modern Christian thought in Age of Humans sounds good, because that means the demons and the old gods who oppressed humanity have gone away, and Christ has brought about the new age. But in mythology, humans getting out of their place, disrupting the natural order of the cosmos, is something horrific. It's pretty much the worst thing possible. So I guess the good ending in Dark Souls is kind of whatever restores the old gods and allows them to continue on for a little bit longer. But eventually the world will end and will have to be rebuilt. And this is kind of what we see in Dark Souls 2, which is the first cycle has basically come to an end in between Dark Souls 1 and 2. And in Dark Souls 2 we see the sun setting, and in Dark Souls 2 we see the sun rising. And Dark Souls 3 almost seems to take place during a renewed Age of Fire. It takes place kind of in a world where magic and the gods and stuff are kind of making a comeback. So Dark Souls, I would say, takes place in the Age of Heroes and kind of transitions to the Age of Man. And there's a lot of different ways of seeing this, but generally speaking, this is seen as the disordered period that will end with the Last Judgment, or will end with the universe being destroyed and being rebuilt.
But only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark side.
So, there we go. I think that was just to give you a little taste of Dark Souls, of mythology, and of how I think they all kind of go together. And those are just kind of some of my thoughts on it. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll do one for Dark Souls 2. 3 is going to be really hard. If you want me to do another one on Dark Souls 1, I certainly can do it. But I hope you enjoyed it. I put a bit more effort into this than I do in a lot of my videos. Have a nice day, everybody. Talk to you later.